the Talk Station is proud to present The War Files. The War Files, a selection of interviews honoring our warriors of the greatest generation, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
My name is Beal Marks.
Where are you living now, Mr. Marks?
I'm living in Morehead City, North Carolina.
And where are you from originally?
Born in Ohio, and I wound up in Newtonville when I joined the Navy.
Newtonville,
Massachusetts. I joined the Navy in Schenectady, where I was a senior at Union College, studying civil engineering.
All right, and you were in World War II?
World War II, yes.
When did you join the Navy?
I joined the Navy in 1942, I think it was June, with the objective of becoming an engineering officer.
Why did you join? What was the motivation?
Well, the motivation, of course, was Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm. Did how many in your class decided to join?
Just about everybody. My fraternity brothers all joined the Army, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard as soon as they could get signed up.
Why the Navy?
I didn't want to sleep in a trench or a foxhole or something like that. I've always liked boats. I knew boats. I wanted to be out in the ocean and that sort of thing.
Where did you train?
I trained at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. I was sent there in September, and I was commissioned ensign in January 1943, and I was given the choice of either going aboard a ship as an engineering officer or going to the Naval Mine Warfare School. And I thought, well, mine warfare sounds interesting, so I put that down as my first choice, and lo and behold, they sent me there. And then I got ordered to Seattle, Washington, to work in the deperming and degaussing ship readiness section of Bremerton Navy Yard. Deperming removes the permanent magnetism or attempts to that a ship develops when it's in dry dock or on the ways for several months. The Earth's magnetic field induces a polarity of the molecules in the ship and becomes like a huge bar magnet. The interesting part, we wound up deperming the USS Tennessee, which had been damaged at Pearl Harbor. And I was in charge of the group laying cables around the hull of the Tennessee. These cables were together. We finally wound up, we had a helix of cables around the whole ship from bow to stern. And then I remember going to the Navy barge, which contained several hundred big lead-acid batteries that were the power for the circuit. I remember the first shot that we gave the Tennessee was 30,000 amperes in the plus direction, and then it would stop, and then we'd give it 30,000 in the minus direction, and then 28,000 and so forth, reducing the ampere current each time until we finally had completed the cycle. The circuit was tripped by a huge breaker. I remember that being on the wall of the barge. And I'm a novice at this whole operation. And I'm sitting there, and when they tripped the breaker, a flash about 3 feet long blew out from the breaker. I must have jumped about 2 feet when the damn thing went off with a huge bam. After that, it was routine, but it was a real scare the first time it tripped.
Now, how long did it take you to
do the deperming
and also degaussing too?
Well, it probably took most of a day to get the cabling all around the ship. She was of course a big battleship. The circuit operation, banging it with the various amperages, that I think that was 2 hours.
Wow. 2
to 3 hours, and we had it all done. Then the ship was toured over magnetometers set in the floor of the harbor, and we had gauges that registered how much of a magnetic field the ship was emitting when it was steaming over these magnetometers. And so we had a before and after signature for the Tennessee. Then they did the degaussing, and after the degaussing was installed, and the Tennessee was again circuit over to the magnetometers to see what her signal was eventually.
Wow. How long did all of this take?
To do the whole thing, probably 2 or 3 weeks. I just learned about how to do degaussing and deperming. The Navy decided that was enough of that and sent me orders to go to the Naval Mine Warfare Test Station in Solomons, Maryland, and reported there to the officer in charge of the Naval Mine Warfare Test Station. I remember Commander Spofford, and he said, "Well, Beal, you've got a top secret clearance, so you're going to be in charge of the group that's testing the Mark 24 mine." The Mark 24 mine was the Western Electric's design of a homing torpedo, which would be launched by a torpedo bomber into the water, and it would cruise at 25 feet below the surface with 4 hydrophones in the nose of the mine. The hydrophones then, via DC amplifiers, operated the rudder and the elevator. And it had an electric motor that drove the screw and propelled it at 12 knots. And the objective was that when a pilot saw a submarine submerge, he dropped the mine right in the wake of the diving sub. And the sub normal undersea speed was 3 to 5 or 6 knots, depending upon what activity it was trying to elude. And the mine would go at 12 knots, and it was tuned to a 24 hertz signal, which was the sound of the screws, pretty much the harmonics of the main cavitation signals. With 100 pounds of Torpex in the nose of the mine and a contact fuse, barge into the sub and blow a hole in the stern, and that would sink the sub. We tested these devices one by one. We had a barge moored in the Patuxent River, and the Patuxent River is unusual, unlike the Potomac and so forth. The Patuxent has a mile-long deep, more than 100 feet deep, and so we would launch these at one end of the deep. We had a hydrophone mounted in a steel cage on the bottom of the river, half a mile away, and the cage was anchored about 90 feet below the surface. And we would drop these mines one at a time from the test barge, and then hit the turn-on switch, drop it in the water with the test head on it, and they would go and look for this signal that was coming from the hydrophone. And the test head, it recorded the depth that the mine was traveling.
So basically you were testing them for
We were
use?
doing a proof testing to make sure they operated properly.
How long did you do this?
I did this from July 43 till the end of December 43.
Then where did you end up?
About September or November, a lieutenant was assigned to my activity, to the test activity. I found out that to go to sea with this, I needed to get a crew of 5 men, and I needed to qualify myself as able to service this mine. By December, I was trained, my crew was trained, and I was then assigned to the USS Guadalcanal, which is an escort aircraft carrier, CVE-60. We arrived, me and my 5-man crew, we arrived in late December and got assigned to the V4 division on board ship, because that was the Air Ordnance Division, and this was obviously air ordnance. It would be carried by the TBM torpedo bombers. I think we got on board the ship January 2nd, and the next day we set out to sea. And I remember scrambling with the first lieutenant of the ship, trying to find ways to store, I think, 8 of these Mark 24 mines, and at the same time keep them top secret so that nobody in the crew would know what the heck they were. So we wound up with a canvassed bay along inside the hangar deck. But we tested them,
But you found a way to hide them on the carrier deck?
Well, we
on
had a canvas
hangar.
enclosure.
Right.
That was it. Yeah.
Wow.
And
did you have to test them regularly while you were at sea?
Yeah, we had to test them. We had a regular routine maintenance schedule that we adhered to. So that's what my 5 men were doing most of the time, was maintenance. To test the circuits, there was a switch. We had a little key that turned on the mine, and then you would pass your hand lightly over the surface of the mine where the hydrophone was located. So as you moved your hand over the top hydrophone, you'd watch the elevator, and it would go up. If it didn't move, you had a bad vacuum tube or something in that DC amplifier circuit. But you test each hydrophone.
They were called the Mark IV, is that correct?
Mark 24.
Mark 24.
That was
what
the
did you do
official name. Well, depending upon what mode of attack the torpedo bombers were instructed to do, we either loaded 4 250-pound depth charges on the bomb shackles, or we would load one 24 Mark 24 mine and 2 depth charges.
Let's talk about the job of the CVE.
The CVE was flagship of a task group. Task group like 22.3 or something. Okay, the task group consisted of 5 destroyer escorts, 4, 5, or 6, depending upon availability. Aircraft carrier provided the air search coverage. The DEs provided the sonar search coverage.
DE being destroyer escort.
Destroyer escorts. So they did the sonar surface hunt. We did the air hunt. And when the first war cruise was January 1944.
Right.
The first thing the Guadalcanal and the escorts did was steam to a specific spot in the Atlantic Ocean, whereby cross beam plotting, the shore stations had identified a location, and they knew that there was going to be a milk cow submarine refueling 2 attack submarines.
These are German submarines we're talking
German
about.
submarines, not too far from the Azores. And Captain Gallery, who was a very sharp, wonderful captain, his objective was to get within 100 miles of the site, out of range of any German submarine radars, but yet well within aircraft range, and launch an attack of 2 or 3 or 4 torpedo bombers to go to and sink the submarines, knowing about the approximate time when they would be on the surface refueling. Unfortunately, we got close to the assigned attack area, and it was terrible weather, gale force winds and high seas and so forth. But we launched, I think, 2 torpedo bombers, and they had a vector to go to make the attack. And lo and behold, one of them or both of them got to where the subs were. And just as one submarine was disengaging, having refueled and setting off to submerge, they made the attack and dropped their depth charges. I was privileged to see the gun sight camera recording of the event, and you could see there was Germans in the water who had escaped from the sinking submarine and debris, and we got credit for one sinking, but we might have damaged or sunk 2 or 3. We never knew. And that was the first attack that the Guadalcanal ever made.
How many were you involved in?
The Guadalcanal, she sunk, I think, 4 German submarines and captured the U-505. Prior to the capture of the U-505 in June 1944, the task group had made a night attack on a German submarine. And they found out that the submarine came to the surface, and everybody started bailing out of the submarine as fast as they could go. The destroyers reported this to Captain Gallery, and he said, well, if they're that anxious to get away from their sub, maybe we could capture them. And so when we got back to port after that attack, Gallery talked with the admirals, and they all laughed at him. They said, you know, you're not going to capture a submarine. There hadn't been a ship captured by the Navy since 1812.
Mm-hmm.
And Gallery said, you wait and see. So as soon as we left Newport News on what turned out to be the capture cruise, we left in May, everybody on board, all the ships in the task group were asked, have you ever been on a submarine? Do you know anything about a submarine? Do you speak German?
Right. In other words,
read German.
So he was preparing everybody for a boarding party.
Everybody for boarding parties.
Mm-hmm.
And our ship had 2 motor whaleboats, 26-foot motor whaleboats, so we wound up with a port and starboard boarding crew.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't involved because I had never even hardly seen a submarine before in my life. We set off, and benefiting from the shore ranging, we were assigned to chase this German submarine, which was on its homeward voyage along the west coast of Africa. And this is June, and we're out there, and for about 2 or 3 weeks, we're looking for this culprit. By that time, the torpedo bombers were flying at night. We were flying 24 hours a day by then. And several times, the torpedo bombers would come in and report that they'd made an attack. And the destroyer escorts would go to where the attack site was reported. And they'd find a life raft or some other debris that had shown up on the airplane's radar, but it wasn't a submarine.
Mm-hmm.
And morning of June 4th, I was standing deck watches as a junior officer. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the USS Chatelaine, who was directly ahead of us, reported that she had a sound contact 1,000 yards ahead of her. As instructed by the OOD, I rang the general alarm on Guadalcanal to alert the whole ship's company to man your battle stations.
Right.
And the Chatelaine launched a hedgehog attack off the bow of the Chatelaine.
Now, a hedgehog. What is a hedgehog?
A hedgehog is an airborne grenade.
Okay.
It's fired by a rocket propulsion off the bow of a DE. There was probably about 50 to 100 of these, and they were fired off. And if they hit a submarine, they had a pretty good charge. They'd blow a small hole in the hull wherever they hit. Fired off hedgehogs where the sub was supposed to be, and of course, no contact. Meantime, they had the pilots in the 2 fighter planes knew of the attack, and they were looking down on the ocean. The ocean was fairly calm, just 1 or 2 foot swells, and the sub was at periscope depth, and they could see it under the water.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Tally ho! We see the sub. We will fire a burst of 50 caliber into the ocean."
Where
To show you exactly where it is, they reported to the Chatelaine that the sub that you have just attacked has turned right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they dove. I'm on the bridge. I have been relieved because there's no need for a JOOD, and I had no other station, so I'm still up there watching. And I could see the fighter planes stoop down and fire. And the Chatelaine rushed in with a full depth charge attack, and she blew everything she had going over that spot. Well, that did the trick. The depth charge, one of them jammed the rudder of the German sub, so all she could do was go in circles. And they came up, and they manned their deck gun, which was a 37 millimeter anti-aircraft, all off to the side of the sub. Our 2 fighter planes are on the opposite side of the submarine. I said to myself, those guys are panicked. Meantime, the Guadalcanal is steaming the other direction, keep out of the way of the surface fight, as an old lady must, you know. And Gallery was instructing away boarding parties, and don't fire any armor-piercing shells into that baby. I want to capture it. So the DEs are all firing at this circling sub. The Pillsbury made an attempt to board the submarine by pulling alongside, but the bow planes ripped a hole in the Pillsbury and damn near sunk her.
Wow.
So she had to pull away, but she launched a motor whaleboat, and a chap by the name of Lieutenant David was in charge of the boarding party. And the Germans, in the meantime, the crew was all in life rafts and so forth, getting off of the submarine. And our boarding parties were just, here's the rafts going this way, the boarding parties are going that way.
Passing each other.
Passing each other. At a reunion 35 years later, I talked with one of the German survivors. And he said, Beal, that's me in that life raft there, in the pictures of the attack.
Mm-hmm.
You could see this guy paddling his life raft. And he said, heading toward our ships.
Did they try to did they try to scuttle the?
They attempted to scuttle the submarine, but what they did was take what's called a sea strainer lid off, which was bolted down, and laid it alongside the sea strainer. So when David and his crew came down the conning tower, they found the submarine, the interior, empty. They found the sea strainer, this water bubbling in, and they put the lid back on, clamped it down, and
who
saved the submarine.
Who steered the submarine home? How did you get the submarine home?
By noon, we had our own boarding crews on board the submarine, and they were attempting to fasten tow line. Well, they got a tow line to the sub, and some of the videos show our crew standing on the bow of the sub, which was the bow and the conning tower were the only parts of the submarine above the surface.
Right.
She was just barely floating, and we got the tow wire to her and towed it for a while. And when I came up for my watch at midnight, when I relieved the junior officer, he said, well, Beal, he says, we're circling the sub. Our tow wire broke. The second tow wire we got on there, it broke because of the damn submarine. As soon as you pulled on it, it wanted to go in a circle.
Because of the jammed rudder.
Because of the jammed rudder.
Right. So what did they finally do?
So next day, Captain Gallery motored over to the submarine, got aboard, and he got to the rear bulkhead watertight door, being aware of that it might be booby trapped. He said, I will open the door. Everybody else stay well back.
Right.
So he grabbed the dogs, opened the door, nothing happened. And now they had access to the stern torpedo bay, and they could get at the steering motors for the rudder by means of crowbars or whatever else. They got the damn thing centered.
You were aboard the Guadalcanal for how long?
A year and a half.
And then from where'd you go from there?
In the spring of 1945, the Navy came out with an almanac that any junior officer who had a year of sea duty, college educated or whatever and so forth, they wanted to have him sign up for postgraduate courses. July of 45, I got my orders to go to Annapolis to the PG school for 2 months of specialized math, and then I was ordered to MIT to the torpedo design group for 1 year torpedo design seminars and courses and so forth. During my stay at MIT, I was promoted to lieutenant.
Did you stay in the Navy?
I talked with the captain of the Naval District in Boston, and I told him that I would like to stay in the Navy. I was well trained and had a wonderful experience on the Guadalcanal and so forth. And he said, well, Beal, he said, we'd love to have you. He says, your qualifications are great. He says, but got to be honest with you, you'll be an ensign, and you may be an ensign for several years before you can be promoted again to lieutenant. And I didn't like the sound of that.
So you exited the Navy.
I got another option. I think I'll take it. I'll go back to MIT and get my master's degree in engineering.
Are you going on the honor flight on November 22nd?
Yes.
Before we wrap things up, and I'm curious about this one question, I've asked this of everybody. What was it about World War II veterans that they never really worried about a memorial or a monument?
Good question. I don't know. I just don't think it ever occurred to us. We were so glad to get back into industry or get back in our lives and so forth. After 4 years of being in the Navy, for instance, I was just delighted to go back, try myself at a real engineering job. So MIT was good to me. They said since I'd passed the torpedo design course, all right, they would take me on as a graduate student, but otherwise I didn't qualify because I wanted to be a mechanical engineer. They did, and I graduated okay with a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and then I went into working in industry. And
Where did you end up? Where did you retire?
well, the first job I had after MIT was with Ingersoll Rand, designing electric-powered torque wrenches. After 3 years at Ingersoll Rand, IBM was looking for engineers, and they gave me a call and said, come on in for an interview. And I was delighted. I went to Endicott, was interviewed, and the next thing I knew, they offered me a huge boost in salary. That determined me to go work for IBM.
When did you retire?
And I retired in 1984.
What brought you to Carteret County?
In the 70s, I crewed on a 43-foot sloop.
So you had visited?
A buddy of mine was taking from Atlantic City, New Jersey to Cape Canaveral, Florida, where he was working. We left Atlantic City in October, and we tied up behind the old docks at Beaufort.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked across Taylor's Creek, and there was the wild horses.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked up and down Front Street in Beaufort. Every store I went into, they said, hi, how are you? It was just the most pleasant experience. And the sun was shining, and the sky was Carolina blue, and I thought, boy, this is where I want to retire.
So where do you live now?
I live in Morehead City.
Morehead City?
In Hammock Place.
Bill, thank you very much for your time. Beal Marks, our guest. Thanks very much. Appreciate this.
You've been listening to The War Files, a selection of interviews honoring our warriors of the greatest generation, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The War Files is a TalkStation presentation.